Welcome, and we want to thank Dr. Schwarz for joining us tonight. He joins us tonight to discuss what will happen to the auto industry when leading car manufacturers no longer dominate and technology startups and ride-sharing applications become larger players, as well as the other implications that autonomous machines will have in our daily lives. And we'll talk about the economics of what this new movement, these new technologies are having on our society. So actually, to start with, why don't I ask you, did you take an autonomous vehicle here to be with us tonight?
Well, there wasn't one available for
I see.
tonight,
Okay.
but I wish there were.
So, but did you drive to this evening?
Yes.
And by yourself?
That's it.
All by yourself in a car, and this is really what about 75% of the population does, right? Is they travel within in their own vehicles. So we know that this is the reality of how cars are today, our patterns. But you're looking at the changes that are coming, and one of the big changes that we see is certainly if you are in some of the major cities and other places, there are cars that have these what they call chicken buckets on top. Some of them have little LiDAR systems on their bumpers. You see them racing on the freeway. You see them going through the city. And these are the precursors to what will be fully autonomous vehicles. But what do you see, and what types of time horizons do you see when it comes to those vehicles becoming fully a part of our landscape?
On some level, they're already fully part of our landscape. So, for example, I think that most people in this room and most of the American public don't realize that cars nowadays very often comes with SIM cards in them. Cars are constantly chattering with the cloud. Your car, it's not the car of the future. It's the car that you can pick up today from a dealership. It comes with a SIM card. It comes with tremendous amount of sensors, and those sensors are uploading data into the cloud, your data, and most of it makes the cars better. Makes the car safer. Those are all great things. So to some extent, this technology is already landing. But I'm a bit of a self-driving car skeptic. I think that it would take longer than most people think for fully self-driving cars to start populating our streets in large numbers. And I think we can see that as much from what we observe as from what we don't observe. So what we don't observe any aspiring self-driving car companies that I know of testing self-driving cars without actually a human backup driver
So
there.
if we see them on the road, they usually have
Right.
somebody sitting
That's
at
right.
the wheel.
That's right. But there's one more thing that we don't observe. All those companies, they are eager to get media attention. They like the spotlight. But none of them announced something like, or at least to my knowledge, none of them announced something like, in the last year, none of our backup drivers have ever had to interfere. Right? So from that, we can kind of guess that maybe there's a little while before we see those mass-produced. I would like to ask you kind of a rhetorical question. I know you're asking the question there, but let me ask you a rhetorical question.
Change roles here, yes.
How would you like living in the world where it takes, on average, 80 million miles before a car runs into a fatal accident? How does that sound?
So my understanding is that we have so many deaths annually in the United States from car accidents that number sounds astounding to me and a very desirable statistic.
So I'm sorry for putting you on the spot.
Yes.
This is the world that we are living in today.
Really?
That is roughly what it is in the United States. So the cars are incredibly safe. It takes 80 million miles to get to a single accident. So just to put it in the context, if you look at, say, Uber self-driving car program, the total number of miles that their vehicles drove in the last couple of years is roughly 2 million miles, right? But just for an average American car, with an average American driver, it takes 80 million miles, roughly, for a single fatality. So that, among other things, means that when you're testing self-driving cars, you can put something like 50 million miles on your test vehicles, and you still would have no idea. And just by the fact that you had no accidents, you would have no idea if that stuff is safer or not than the cars we drive today. So yes, cars are tremendously dangerous. We have somewhere around 30,000 people killed in the United States by car, but they're also tremendously safe. It takes about 80 million miles to one fatality, and that's because we drive a lot of miles. That's just a very simple, brutal math.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've got to check my odometer now because it's really, I don't think it goes that high. But what you're suggesting then is that I'm not going to wake up tomorrow morning and look and go outside and have a car just show up without a driver that I can just jump in and it'll take me wherever I want. What kind of a time horizon do you think? You've told us why we're not going to see it soon, but when do you think in your economics, and I know that you're more involved in the science of economics than you are in the prediction business, but what do you see in terms of when those cars will land outside my door by themselves?
I could tell you that I don't have a crystal ball, but I actually do. But my crystal ball, it lacks the time scale. So I don't know exactly what will happen, and I can tell you. And if you want to be surprised by the future, you should just kind of seal your ears, because it's nice to be surprised by the future. But unfortunately, my crystal ball doesn't have a timeline, so I know what will happen, but I don't know when.
Mm-hmm. And when it does happen, when these things do show up, they will not necessarily look the way they look today. They won't be passenger cars that are made for families. They'll be made for something different.
Just like today, we have huge diversity of cars, right? We have minivans, and we can have two-seaters. Certainly, in the self-driving world, we will continue to be a diversity of cars. But I think that one thing that my crystal ball tells me that the entire transportation sector is going to be revolutionized in the next something like 20 years, although my crystal ball really doesn't have a timeline. But I think that there would be a couple of other extremely important developments that would be in part triggered by self-driving car revolution, but that are happening right now as we speak, and nobody pays much attention to those. And let me tell you what those are. So one technology that is, in my opinion, just as important as self-driving car, but much less revolutionary, much less glamorous, nobody talks about it, and that's technology for simply collecting tolls. We currently...
Okay, so we've got the autonomous cars, and one of the technologies is what we, on a daily basis, maybe know as an easy pass or a fast track pass, but the toll collection, that would be a technological development. I mean, from moving from where you used to stop at a toll booth to have to pay somebody on a road or on a bridge to something that's much more automated.
Right. So I think in the future, when we look at EasyPass, we'll think of it as Stone Age technology. Just like today, when Singapore first launched the first tolls, they had different color pieces of paper that drivers would display on the windshield, and there would be people checking if you kind of had the right ticket. And now we look at it and go, well, that's pretty backward. So I think in the future we will kind of look the same way at EasyPass, because right now tolls are still only on kind of really major roads, and the reason is it's really expensive to basically have that physical infrastructure. It's cumbersome, and tolls really don't work very well when you only have them on small number of roads. What you want an infrastructure where pretty much any intersection could have easily enabled toll. And let me tell you what the connection is between self-driving cars and tolls. There is one. Well, obviously, both technologies are kind of powered by advances in things like cloud and satellite technology and GPS technology and so on and so forth. But there is something else. Once you have self-driving cars, commute would become much more comfortable. Maybe you can sleep in a car. That would be lovely, wouldn't it? And then maybe you can live in that fabulous place a little bit farther away with a huge backyard and stuff. And then if everybody else does that, you will have more traffic and tolls would become more necessary. But of course, we are already stuck in traffic in many major metropolitan areas. And the only reason, so to some extent, if you look at traffic, when I look at traffic as an economist, I think about it as a market failure. There's no other word for it. Like I grew up in the Soviet Union, and in the Soviet Union, if you want to buy bread, if you want to buy meat, well, you stay in line because, well, there's not enough meat for everybody, so the way we decide to ration it, people would waste a lot of time in order to get their piece. So that's exactly how we are rationing highways that also have and city streets that also have limited capacity. You have to stay in line and wait for your turn instead of, well, just charging the right price so that supply and demand balances. So why don't we do it? Well, right now we simply don't have technology for collecting tolls sufficiently seamlessly on every street, on every intersection where there's traffic congestion. So this is one thing that I think is going to be coming in the future.
Well, it's interesting because you're calling it a market failure, and this is an economist's perspective, but I think when you get to election time, people usually look at it as a political failure. They often talk and cite traffic congestion, even though the reality may be that it's a market failure, but that it's a failure of our political leadership to actually do something, and maybe there is nothing to do, and maybe these tolls, this automated toll system is in fact a means by which political leadership can work with economic reality to alleviate that irritant that we face on a regular basis.
Oh, I agree with you completely, and I particularly agree with an assertion that it's really not the fault of political leadership, because really technology for solving this problem right now is not quite available. We are very, very close to having that technology ready and available and deployable. But today, if you are a mayor of the city, if you're a governor, if you're a king or dictator, no matter who you are, there is no company that you can call up and say, hey guys, we decided to do a progressive thing. We are going to put tolls, we don't want to have any traffic, we want to maximize the economic efficiency, and we want to augment state revenues in the process from toll revenues. Does anybody have that solution for us? The answer is actually no. There are a bunch of companies that say, well, we can put tolls on your major roads, but if you only put tolls on the major roads, you may end up even with even worse congestion as people try to basically drive longer in order to just bypass that toll. So it's a very mixed blessing.
Right. It's interesting because it seems that as you're talking about this, one of the things that you've worked on was how to alleviate congestion for the average driver, because there was a company called Waze, and many of us have this app on our telephones, and this in fact would do exactly what you're suggesting, which is reroute us to avoid what may be in the future an economic traffic problem rather than an automotive traffic problem, so that you can avoid tolls.
Well, so that is exactly the reason why you need technologies that tolls could be charged at every intersection. So if tolls are set appropriately, you would always set a zero toll on a road that's under capacity, because adding an extra car doesn't really delay anybody. And when tolls are set appropriately, you would simply don't have an incentive to kind of reroute yourself in ways that are inefficient or unhealthy.
Right, but how does that then keep wealthy Rolls-Royce driving vehicles from not having a greater privilege than those who are carpooling in their VW Bug from the 60s?
So I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that brings us to another technology that's going to revolutionize transportation. That's going to be, like, I think of those as kind of three pillars that's going to revolutionize transportation. And the first two we already talked about, self-driving cars and tolls. But there's a third pillar that's equally important, and that is carpooling. And right now, you see we have carpooling in the United States is basically in single digit, and that also includes people who carpool who are roommates or relatives. So it's not, carpooling is not unusual, but it's certainly not common. It's not part of our day-to-day reality. And there are many reasons for it. And one of the reasons, again, that we simply lack fine-tuned perfect technology for carpooling. Until very recently, pretty much the best technology for carpooling were little pieces of paper on a
on
bulletin
right,
board,
and you'd say, hey, I'm trying
in
to
your
get
college
to,
dorm.
yes.
Right, that's a pretty terrible technology. So then with internet, things started to get better. And there are a number of companies, including my former employer, that are making efforts in these directions that I think are wonderful. But it's still not perfect, but we are getting there. So let me give you kind of one example. Whoever you are and wherever you live, when you leave this room, it's almost certainly the case that within 10 minutes of you leaving this room, there would be another 100 people driving somewhere within a few minutes from this building who could drive you all the way to your house, and it would only take them a couple of extra minutes because they either live close to you or they don't live close to you, but the route to their home is near your home. And that's just an empirical truth. That's a statistical truth. We know it's to be the case. The question is, could you find those people? And right now, we do have, in principle, we could create technology that would make it completely seamless and completely easy. We are not quite there yet. And there are many obstacles, and some of them are cultural, and some of them are technological. And some of them is, we don't have tolls. So let's say, for example, there's someone who just lives, who has a short drive, 5 miles. So what does he have to gain? If parking is not a problem, what does he have to gain from carpooling? Well, almost nothing. You're stuck. Maybe it's a very congested street. Maybe you're stuck in traffic in that terribly busy metropolis for 30 minutes, for an hour, just to drive several miles. Would you like to pick up a carpooler? The answer is, absolutely not. Even if it's a very short detour, what are you saving, right? The cost of driving small number of miles is really low. So you would drive and the other guy would drive, and you have no incentive to carpool even if you know each other. Well, what if there is no traffic because there are tolls that make sure that supply and demand equilibrate, but if you carpool, you can split the cost of the toll 2 ways, or 3 ways, or 4 ways. Suddenly you have tremendous incentive to carpool, and the greater is demand for roads, the higher the tolls, the stronger is incentive to carpool. If a toll for your commute from work to home was, say, $40, well, if you can find another three carpool partners, it becomes $10 when you split it 4 ways. So the incentives to carpool would become much, much stronger when we have tolls. And that, of course, would ameliorate traffic by quite a bit. And I think that is why carpooling is so important, because not only it helps to put through more people through the roads, but it also makes it much more politically feasible to create to have high tolls, because actually all of us could be better off. A rich guy who drives Rolls-Royce would be better off because, well, he would just pay a very high toll, but he wouldn't be wasting his time in traffic. A middle-class person who doesn't want to pay a very high toll would be able to easily and seamlessly find a carpool partner or several carpool partners, and they would save a lot of time because, again, if you have appropriately set tolls, there would not be traffic, so they wouldn't have to waste time in traffic, and they would be able to carpool together, and the tolls would become a small price to pay for not wasting time in traffic. And of course, the taxpayer wins, and all of us are taxpayers, if instead of paying for roads by wasting time, we would be paying for roads by writing checks and building schools out of those checks.
So it raises a number of questions because it seems to some degree that it is an indirect tax, a usage tax, almost like a VAT type of tax, right, for those who are driving and who are taking advantage of that, who are living farther from their workplaces. But I think what you're also saying is that it balances out, because if you have these advantages, my understanding, and you're the one doing the econometric modeling here, but it would seem that you also are likely to increase productivity in the workforce because you're not spending your time, for example, in traffic. Instead of doing that, or you're not even driving if you have an autonomous vehicle because you can sit in your car and do work.
Absolutely.
For instance. So as you model these things out and look at the frictions that exist in today's model of trafficked, non-self-driving cars where we don't carpool, you see great inefficiencies, you see great friction. But as we move towards this other model, assuming that we are willing as a populace or as a society to tax ourselves for usage, which may be a very difficult political problem, but let's assume that, you're seeing also that the productivity gains that are going to come out of all of this change, this triumvirate of carpooling, tolling, and autonomy, are going to pay multiple dividends back and allow us to actually afford this in a very flexible and free way.
Absolutely.
Okay, when can we get going on this? It just sounds like the perfect political solution, because I'm also listening, as I listen to you, it seems to me that if we have these three things, you're also going to be able not only to have traffic-free driving, but it seems that the infrastructure we have will also allow for greater capacity. And let me explain a bit what I mean, and maybe I'm wrong here, but if I'm driving at 60 miles an hour on the freeway, I need to leave 6 car lengths between me and the car in front of me. But if the car in front of me and the car that I'm in are really smart cars and are talking to each other, then maybe you only need 1 car length between them, which means you've increased your capacity significantly, which means the roads that we have, albeit they may need potholes that need to be filled and they may need to be more maintained because of many more miles that are being driven. But the point would be that we actually may not need new easements or new infrastructure in those to accommodate the traffic.
Right. So I think that here's where I really don't have a crystal ball, and I totally agree with you. I think it kind of could go either way, because on one hand, once you have self-driving cars, people drive more because driving becomes easier, and that would tilt us towards more congestion unless we use other technologies like tolls and carpooling in order to ease that congestion, right? So on the other hand, things kind of could get worse. But things could also, as you pointed out, could get better because self-driving cars might end up being better than human drivers, and we might be able to have higher throughputs on the roads. So which one is going to win between those two effects? Well, on this one, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't think anybody does. But I think it's I don't like betting. I'm not a gambler. but if I were, I'll probably bet that at least in some areas, it would be the increase in driving that would dominate the increase in throughput.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's fascinating to me because we really are at a point where at least in the United States, we're facing, and this is something that the president talks about as well, an infrastructure problem where the roads that we're driving on are having challenges. The bridges that we drive over are aging, and being able to finance that is going to be key as we move forward further into the 21st century. Do you have any understanding, or do you build within your models the ability to see how infrastructure will find its, will it be a smarter infrastructure? Are we counting on the automated vehicles uploading and talking to each other to provide the type of data? Do we need to put new things in the roads, for instance, or new lines or electronic devices that will also increase the expenditures that governments need to make?
I think our infrastructure gets smarter by the day, and some of the time building smarter infrastructure does not require making a smarter road, because as the cars get smarter, so let me give you one example. In some towns, the way they measure the number of cars that pass on the road, you put something physical that every car crosses, and you have a counter, and you know how many cars passed through a particular road, and that's how you do a traffic study, right? So you can say, well, that was pretty smart infrastructure. We put something on the road, great. But of course now there are better and better ways of doing it, right? Our phones are part of our smart road infrastructure because, well, you can learn the movements of people through phones. And by the way, your phone knows if you are in a car or if you're walking, or your phone could even figure out if you're on a bus or if you are driving, because buses make stops and cars don't make the same kind of stops that buses do, right? So all of that is kind of the smarts that are smarts of the road, but they're not smarts in the road. And I think we'll certainly see more and more of those smarts as well. So I think in terms of infrastructure investments, my hope is that as we would start collecting tolls, those funds will be reinvested into the infrastructure, and we'll end up with much better infrastructure. And here, I'm not a political scientist, I'm an economist, but I would like to make a sort of semi-obvious political economics point, or maybe it's not semi-obvious. So when you, let's imagine that the government starts collecting tolls, and that the tolls go into funding public goods in general, that would actually create a tremendous political risk. And the risk would be that the tolls that would kind of maximize the well-being of citizens are very, very different from the tolls that maximize revenues. Because if you want a toll that, if you want a toll that is efficient from economic point of view, it should always be zero when the road is not congested. Well, many of the tolls that we have today are actually not zero even during the nighttime. And if you think about it, well, if you were to set it to zero, that would be great, because maybe some people who drive kind of at more busier times would actually switch because of the low price. So oftentimes we don't do it because some of the toll authorities actually like revenues. So basically, if you collect tolls, the wider are your roads, if you do things kind of efficiently, the less toll revenues you're going to get. So unless you have certain rules that ensure that toll revenues are actually reinvested into infrastructure, you will have incentives for the governments to keep infrastructure really constrained so that they generate lots of profit. And that would not be good for everybody.
Yeah, well, that's great. So let me go to some of the questions here. And we've got a very active audience and one that clearly pays attention to trends in technology and in the auto industry. And one of the interesting questions that came up is, what is your take on the future of the auto insurance industry in the era of self-driving cars? That's a fairly interesting. I mean, would that fall into one of the losers in the category of the future?
I think all of us want safer transportation, and all of us want cheaper car insurance. Well, if there are less accidents, it doesn't necessarily mean that car insurance companies would make less money. We all might be winners. We may end up having fewer accidents and cheaper car insurance, and car insurance companies might still end up with the same amount of profit that they derive today. So I think that it's quite plausible that we will see significant changes in car insurance industries that are caused by self-driving car revolution way before the first fully self-driving car becomes available at the marketplace. And the reason is that we already have tremendous amount of telemetry data. And when the car has some self-driving capabilities, even very limited, it actually might be able to detect when you were in a near accident situation and base insurance premiums on that. Obviously any data is useful, right? Even data like, oh, this person often brakes very heavily and this person doesn't. Well, that is helpful, but that's not going to predict accidents nearly as much as detailed data where a car says, in my humble opinion, that was a real close call. And when that determination is made based on the speed, the road condition, how far was the car in front of you, how far was the car behind you, and not just how quickly you are braking. So once that data becomes available, I think it would make a lot of sense for insurance companies to start using it. And I think we will all benefit from it. Because, and you can say, wait, how could all of us benefit from it? The good drivers would benefit, the bad drivers will not. The premiums would go up. And that might happen, but I think something else would happen because the bad drivers might become better drivers because your car may be able to say, hey, aren't you getting here in a tricky situation? Why won't you have longer distance or your insurance premiums could go up. So our cars could become our driving instructors or could behave in a way similar to the way our spouses sometimes behave, except our spouses have very limited ability to raise our insurance premium. The only way they can do it is by wrecking a car.
I see. Well, this is important to me because I have two teenagers at home, and so they could use an auto instructor who's going to constantly give them feedback. But really, as we talk about this data that's being created by individuals, by our technologies, what we carry in our pockets, what we drive, it invariably will raise the question of privacy. And how, when you look at the economics of these models that you're putting together, how do you account for our desire to have a modicum of privacy, which we're now on a daily basis understanding that we have less of as a result of some of the things that have occurred in the last year, whether they be in the political realm or even in the technology and social media realm. How do you account for that as you try to make these decisions on how individuals try to maximize their utility, but also, you know, achieve those social goods that they want to hold on to, privacy.
Well, so I think that sort of privacy is certainly an area where we are wrestling right now in many, many spheres of our lives, right? Like it's a scary thought that our grandchildren might well be able to not only read every single email that we ever wrote, there is even a danger that they would be able to not just search for particular names in those emails, but they might conceivably be able to ask for a search like grandfather's most embarrassing moments, and an intelligent algorithm would try to identify what those most embarrassing moments were. So all those things are kind of scary and concerning and complicated. And I think certainly the transportation space is not an exception. I think there are many things that we can do to collect data in basically some sort of reduced, summarized form that is semi-anonymized. You know, there's many people will not want to have like a full record of everything they do every day, minute by minute. But I think it's totally reasonable to tell someone, look, if you're driving on public roads, we really would like to have a couple of numbers that summarize your risk level, and we also would like to give you feedback on that. So I think some of that actually could be done in a fully privacy-preserving way. So for example, imagine your car never telling anybody about what you're doing, which is, by the way, probably not the case about your car. I don't know what car you drive, but if it's a new car, you can read your terms and conditions, and you might see that telemetric data is collected.
Yes.
But you could imagine an agreement where it's not being collected, it stays completely with you, but you know, you're not an enemy of yourself either, right? So if your car could tell you to do or not to do certain things that could save your life, that would probably be nice.
Yeah.
And you would most definitely impose that on your teenagers.
Yes, that is definitely the case. But so as you think about the economics of all these things, do you try to figure out what the price of privacy might be for individuals as you say, well, you know, yes, we want all this telemetric data. We want to know whether it be for actuarial purposes, for insurance purposes, or others. We're willing to pay for them. We know that today, free is a very good price for my privacy data on social media, for example, and we've made those trade-offs, sometimes not so consciously, by reflexively ticking off, I agree, but on the terms of service agreements that we have. But as we become more sophisticated about our privacy and about our data and look at it as something which is valuable, in fact, maybe even the most valuable thing that we possess as we go forward, do you as an economist then try to figure out what that price is? And of course, it may vary in different circumstances.
Well, I'm not a privacy expert, but I personally believe that we as individuals, we as users, we should own our data, and we should have control over our data. And I think we as technologists should be creating more tools that would allow people to monitor how the data is used and to kind of have meaningful controls, as opposed to controls where kind of you say, well, by clicking on this button, you agree to everything in the user agreement that you never read. So I think that you know, we as a society are still kind of wrestling with creating those tools that would give us better control, more meaningful control. And I think we as individuals often don't fully understand, actually, most of us, I think, don't understand what our preferences in that domain, and what are the things that we are afraid of, and what are the things that we actually want. And I think, again, moving forward, we, both as individuals and as a society, will be figuring it out. And I think it behooves technology companies to do their best trying to create tools that would actually help people to make to be in control and in the driver's seat in that respect.
Great. So let's move from privacy to private ownership. What happens when we have cars in this autonomous reality? What happens from the ownership perspective? Will we own fewer cars? Is it just going to be? Will there be collective cars like these bicycles and scooters that we see on the street? You just pick up and ride off on?
Well, I'm really glad you asked this question. In one of my papers, actually the paper is so I have a paper about the future of transportation and self-driving car and carpooling. And one of the things that we look at this paper is the question of how the car ownership structure is likely to change as a result of when self-driving cars become available. And there's a very common opinion that basically car ownership just will have to die. And it will have to die because self-driving car is very easily shareable, unlike a regular car. And as a result, it would be just prohibitively expensive to own a self-driving car, where basically, well, cars pretty much 95% of the time they're not used, right? So it would be prohibitively expensive to own a car. So many people believe that simply car ownership would die, or only like super wealthy people will own cars. And I think, I don't believe that. And I think that, so obviously, there would be shared vehicles because, well, it is true that it's very convenient to share self-driving cars, and it makes a lot of sense. But I don't think that individual car ownership will become prohibitively expensive. And here's a very, very simple back-of-the-envelope calculation that shows that under some ridiculous assumptions, or not so ridiculous assumptions. So most cars today do not survive 200,000 mile mark. They just die from mileage. And we don't know what the cars of the future would be like. But if we were to imagine for a second that the cars of the future would be similar to the cars of today in terms of durability, which is not quite true. The cars would start becoming more durable. There would be more investment into building more durable cars. But let's say, for the sake of the argument, that the cars will remain about as durable as they are today. So then if you share the car 24/7, you would be putting tremendous number of miles on those cars. So then those cars would die very quickly. They would not die of old age, they would die of miles. And that means that what you would be saving, like, if your car's utilization is 5%, if you triple utilization, you say, well, am I saving 2/3 of the cost? And the answer is no, because the car is used so intensively, it would simply die very quickly. And, well, you'll have to replace it with a new car. So the economic savings are actually relatively modest. And that means that I think some people who enjoy owning a car, who enjoy having golf clubs in the trunk, will continue owning cars, and it would cost them a little bit more than to have a shared vehicle, but it wouldn't be an enormous cost differential.
Okay, so you're predicting people will play golf in the future. That's good. Moving from ownership to the question of our commons and of our collective environment, there are a number of questions here that come to the question of greenhouse gases, vehicles. Oftentimes when we think about autonomous vehicles, autonomously driving vehicles, we often relate them to another technology which is evolving, which are electric vehicles, and the reduced potential for greenhouse gases. Do you have any sort of prediction on this front in terms of whether or not these self-driving cars may or may not be electric, and whether or not it will clear our air and allow for us to breathe freer?
Well, I think I'm actually an optimist in this department, which is rare for me. I think it.
You're an economist.
That's right. So I think it does make a lot of sense for self-driving cars to be electric. One of the reasons is that one of the obstacles to electric cars is that currently we don't have a great charging infrastructure, and it also takes a while to charge a car. If cars are self-driving, they can drive themselves to a charging station. Also, if God forbid your car ran out of juice, you can just say, you know what, I'll have this car charging here. I'll grab another one. It would get me home. My car would get home by itself later. It doesn't happen often. It happens, maybe once a year. And when it does happen, it's no big deal. So I think that there are a lot of things that are complementary between electric cars and self-driving cars.
Okay. As we look at these technologies, and again, a number of our questions are looking at specific technologies here, whether they be about environmental technologies or toll-taking technologies. But one of the themes that and interests that exists out there is the curiosity as to who is going to develop this. And one of the questions is Microsoft investing in this type of R&D, the company where you work, and why? And what other companies should we be looking towards for this cutting-edge development?
So one thing that I can tell you that in my opinion, kind of self-driving car space is still largely open. A lot of people declaring winners, but it ain't over till it's over, and it ain't going to be over for a while. So I'd say absolutely anything could happen, and anything could happen in even a number of countries. It doesn't have to come out of the US. It doesn't have to come out from whoever is currently ahead. Many things could happen, and many things could surprise us.
Well, it's interesting because, and some folks in the audience also are curious about this, it seems that the Chinese government and some of Chinese industry, in particular Geely, I think is the name of the company, but the Chinese government too is making a significant bet in AI technology, saying that they will dominate the technological developments. Do you see this type of state-driven and incentivized development in technology as potentially being a competitive threat to whether it be Microsoft or other countries' work today?
I don't think any country has a monopoly on technology, and there are certainly U.S. is certainly ahead in a number of important technologies, including this one. But there are certainly formidable companies in China, and if you look at U.S. universities, you would certainly see a lot of graduate students, some of the best, who are coming from China. So it's not surprising me that China is making investments in technology, as they should.
Yeah, the question is really if their focus as a nation and their clear desire to dominate this space, and I'm using their terminology here because it really is part of the plan and the Chinese dream that Xi Jinping has discussed. If in your experience, because you came from a country where there was also this market direction that was decided by the state, but things have changed, of course, and we're not looking at communism versus capitalism here. We're looking at a different form of capitalism, which is a state-run capitalism. Do you see the potential for this domination occurring? And as I recall, I too lived in the Soviet Union as a foreign correspondent in the early 90s. What was clear was that there was a high level of educational understanding and ability within the professional classes in the sciences and what we would call the STEM areas today. And I think that same type of focus is what we're seeing not only in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, but also in China. Does that, in your mind, and certainly from your perch at Microsoft, present the type of competitive challenge to Western-based technology organizations that that others seem to fear today?
Well, so I'm not an expert on China. I really don't know that much about China, but I know something about our own history. And when you look at the history of US technology, a lot of technologies where we are currently dominant and technologies that are very important for our society, and that includes internet, GPS technology, information processing technology, and many other technologies, a lot of those technologies emerged from government-funded, NSF-funded research. A lot of those technologies exist because our government had wisdom in previous generations to invest in basic science. And we are seeing that today the government is not investing in basic science at, like if you take the ratio between investment in basic science by companies like Microsoft and other major technology companies, you would see that kind of the size of government investment relative to the size of private investment, the government investment is really shrinking, and I do worry about it, and especially with regard to more basic science, the kind of investments that our fathers made with their tax dollars. They're funding our prosperity in technology. Are we doing the same today?
And I hope you're not asking me.
A rhetorical question.
Yes, it is a rhetorical question because I can't answer that question, but it is probably the single most important question as we look to the future and the prospects of how our society evolves and competes in this world where things are much more open and we have become much more globalized. I'll come back to the questions here. We talked about carpooling, we talked about Waze, but on the toll front, the question here is, which cities or regions in the world are the leaders in toll collection? And certainly my recollection, the first time I went to Singapore, is that they were the first place I had ever seen roads sort of shutting down or becoming more expensive as a result of congestion.
Absolutely. I would also name Singapore. There is no question about it.
Are other countries or regions picking up on this today? I mean, we know that Beijing, for example, has probably a worse traffic problem than Boston. Is Beijing doing anything about this? Are they moving into this toll collection realm?
Not that I know of.
Okay. So, do you envision a world, asks one of our questioners, where there is a different toll each time you turn a corner? And how can you keep a toll system simple?
Oh, that's
in 20 words or less.
That's a billion-dollar question. I think there are many ways to keep a toll system simple. So first of all, many of us are using navigation apps. So you could imagine a toll system that where a toll is different during different hours of the day, but it pretty much stays the same for the same type of the time of the day every day of the week for weekdays, right? So there you will know exactly what are the tolls for you getting from home to work. And there may be a couple of routes that you can take, and you would know tolls for each of them, and that would be simple enough. And once in a blue moon, tolls might change, and you would see that the price changed. And that doesn't seem too difficult. And when you're driving in your route, you would enter origin destination, you would see what routes are available and what tolls are, and you would also easily see how much money you can save by moving to off-peak hours. Mm-hmm. So I actually don't think that, if GPS technology didn't exist, then it would be really difficult to have a simple system for tolls, but I think today it actually isn't.
Right. So another questioner wants to know about the rise of self-driving cars and AI, artificial intelligence, in general, but in particular on the labor market. Clearly, it's going to affect our jobs, the way we work, the amount of time we spend in cars, and what we do in cars. Could you give us a little bit more as to what you think happens to the labor market? Will we all be unemployed?
Well, actually, I'm not. I'm again an optimist there, because again, I think that the change is not going to come overnight. It would be a slow and gradual change, and some of the like automation creates jobs, automation destroys jobs, and if the change happens really quickly, it's really, really painful for people who are displaced, and that could create a lot of disruption in people's lives. But if the change is relatively gradual, new technology creates certain jobs, destroys certain jobs, and if people have time to migrate, they will. And actually, if you would look at jobs of drivers, what you would see is that this is not a skilled occupation. You don't make a tremendous investment to become a driver. And it is not an occupation where people tend to stick. I mean, some people do stick with that occupation for the entire career, but a very, very large number of drivers go in and out of that occupation, right? So that time horizon, so for example, if you would look at people who drive for living for companies like Lyft and Uber, you would see that there's lots of driver turnover, right? So if people are kind of, if half of your drivers are turning over within a 3-year period, if change takes, a decade or more, then basically it's simply that the drivers who are going to turn over anyway would turn over, and simply would not be replaced by a new crop of drivers who would do something else in the economy where new jobs are enabled by technology every day.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it raises the question of unskilled labor and what their prospects are as we automate, roboticize, and migrate to these new technologies that actually do repetitive types of things, whether they be on the production line or at a higher level in the automobile. And so one of the questioners here says, do you think this technology will add an unnecessary burden on the lower class part of the population?
You mean the self-driving car technology?
Yes, and sort of the trends that we're seeing that are going to develop all around our society as we automate and as AI starts to take over repetitive functions that are often reserved for an unskilled or uneducated part of our society, obviously jobs that are less well-paying as well in today's society that can be done for virtually free if in fact you impose these and evolve and adopt these new technologies.
I think it's extremely, extremely difficult to predict how technology would impact the labor market. And let me give you an example that is completely hypothetical, but just illustrates how things could really go in completely unexpected directions. For example, right now AI is used to automate some of the customer service tasks, and some of the Microsoft technology is doing a wonderful job automating some of the tasks that customer service people do. So your first reaction would be, well, if you're in customer service, this is really bad news because, well, machines are taking over your job. Wouldn't that be terrible, right? And say, well, certainly technology is not quite there, yet. It just automates certain parts of the job. And I say, wait a second, it's actually not at all obvious because a lot of companies provide very, very little customer care because customer care is so expensive, right? So and that's true for many tech many internet companies. Pretty much make sure that they never talk to a user because talking to a user is prohibitively expensive, right? So if you would ask people in this room, have you ever used customer care of any internet company? Maybe there would be one person who used it. Maybe someone knows someone who used it, but it's super rare. Did you ever need customer care there? Oh, absolutely, all of us did, right? So if there were really great automation technology there, the demand for customer care that becomes, let's say we can automate 99% of the job, right? So the first reaction would be, well, if it's 99% automated, 99% of people will lose their jobs. But then I say, wait a second. If it's 99% automated, it would be freaking 100 times cheaper. If it's 100 times cheaper, quite possibly there would be 1,000 times more of customer care provided and demanded. And then, since 1% is still not automated, you may actually have a huge spike in demand for those customer care jobs because there are certain tasks that computers couldn't do and you need humans for that. And when the thing gets tremendously cheaper, demand goes up. And you can say, well, gee, wasn't that a cooked up, hypothetical, completely unrealistic, ridiculous example? And the answer is absolutely not. So when IBM developed the first hard drive, that thing was a beast. It was maybe not quite as big as this room, but it was pretty mighty big. It was, I believe, over $1 million, and it stored much less data than your phone could store. And a reasonable estimation of world's demand for those things was, in dozens. And that was kind of the projection. And then you can say, well, gee, if that thing becomes like 100,000 times cheaper, what would happen with like all those engineers who are making a living out of it? Well, yeah, if the demand were to stay at 24, that wouldn't be very good. But actually, as you know, as tech was becoming cheaper and cheaper, and as it was become possible to do so much more with so much less labor, the demand for tech labor actually exploded. So we've been there. So that's one of many examples where it could kind of go either way. If you would have used IT technology today on the level of 1980, we will probably need 1,000 times fewer engineers. But because the technology is so cheap, we use so much of it that we actually need a lot more engineers than we ever did.
Well, I want to say that you've been true to your word. You have been an optimist tonight, and it's a wonderful experience to actually have an economist who has such a positive outlook on the future. And it's probably appropriate that you're working at a technology company. This will end the recorded portion of our evening. I want you all to join me in thanking Dr. Schwarz for his presentation this evening and for his participation.
Thank you very much.